Welcome to today's program titled Diverse Slates. This 30-minute session is part of Seyfarth Shaw's Inclusion and Diversity webinar series. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials along with the CLE attendance form will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw, LLP for informational purposes only. Material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Annette Timon. Annette, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and welcome to everybody who has joined us. And we see the numbers keep climbing in terms of folks who are on the call. So we thank you for joining us this afternoon for what is our fourth webinar in the series on diversity inclusion issues. We started this journey last year talking about, first starting with a broad overview of the topics that typically come up for employers as they're implementing a robust DE&I strategy. We focused then on goals, and just earlier this week, we had a webinar on employee resource groups. So we're here in our fourth series. We do plan to continue these in the upcoming year and covering such topics, for example, around transparency and global issues, how to set global DE&I efforts. So those are topics that we are planning for the upcoming year. So be on the lookout for those as well. Joining me today on this call, so my name is Annette Timon. I am a partner here at the firm and co-lead our people analytics practice. I am joined by my esteemed colleagues, Laura Mecklin, who is our national chair of our labor and employment department, along with Sade Tidwell, who is an associate on the people analytics team as well. So that's who you have joining us today. We'll now turn to the topics that we'll cover in this particular session. We're titling this as a micro webinar because it is a discrete topic area that we are focused in on. We'll start by talking about what do we mean by diverse slates. We'll give you some our top 3 considerations, talk about some best practices, and then wrap things up in just a half an hour. So with that, I will turn it over to Sade, who's going to kick us off with some background information.
Thank you, Annette. All right, so we're going to start off with what are diverse slates. So diverse slates are a program, and they are a type of diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that implements a presumption that a diverse pool of candidates will be interviewed before hiring decisions are made. Those diversity requirements are typically guided by the overall diversity goals of the company and areas of opportunity within the company. Diversity is typically looked at along the lines of race and gender, although as the definition of diversity broadens, companies may decide to require other forms of diversity. Diverse slates are an outgrowth of the Rooney Rule, which came about it was adopted in 2003. The Rooney Rule is basically an NFL policy that required every team with a head coaching vacancy to interview at least one or more diverse candidates. The ultimate aim of the program was to increase minority representation amongst leadership in the NFL. And diverse slate requirements kind of follow the same spirit. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to implementing diverse slate requirements. And some considerations companies face are whether to require diversity at the applicant stage or later in the hiring process at the interview stage, or whether the requirements should be mandatory or simply suggestive. And if they are mandatory, what does an exception process look like? What will the group what group will ensure diversity? So will that be the HR group or the talent acquisition group, et cetera? Those are just some high-level considerations, and Annette will speak, of course, in more detail about those. And as we said, the level of risk is really assessed on a spectrum. So the risk is greater as it's more associated with a person's protected characteristics. So there's generally less risk with requiring diverse interview panels because in those instances, there's no adverse employment action. However, despite there being less risk, there are also some practical considerations that employers will want to be mindful of, including whether they want to limit the diverse panel to only key positions that after the company has ran some type of data analysis, they determine that there are areas of opportunity in specific departments. And so it might be prudent for companies to prioritize those vacancies or to determine whether or not they want to require all interviewers to be in the same department so that when the diverse interview panels are assessing the interview candidates, they're basing it on factors that are related to the job. So that can also avoid the risk of, the interview panelists selecting candidates based on race or gender. Additionally, another benefit of prioritizing, kind of going back to the first consideration, another benefit of prioritizing those positions that have shown some type of shortfall or opportunity for improvement is just so also to avoid administrative burnout. You don't want to continuously ask the same diverse interview panelists to join these interviews. You don't want to burn them out and make them feel like they're doing too much to that end. There's also considerations dealing with whether or not you want a certain number of diverse interview panelists. You want it to be 50% diverse, and on what basis? Is it based on race or gender? And that will all be guided by the goals of the company. And we can go to the next slide. So as you consider how to move forward in implementing your Diverse Slate program, it is important to understand the legal framework and background under which United States employers operate. Ultimately, employers must operate their proactive efforts to increase minority representation and enhance diversity overall within the organization with equal opportunity laws like Title VII and other state-related laws. So within Title VII, there are different types of discrimination, and generally there's disparate treatment discrimination and disparate impact discrimination. So disparate impact discrimination is typically unintentional, whereas disparate treatment discrimination is intentional. So an example of disparate treatment discrimination will be where a company is explicitly hiring based on race or gender. And in those instances, although the company is engaging in something positive, which is to increase their minority representation, maybe they have a history of, a shortfall in a particular department of female, and they want to increase their female presence in that department. They have a positive goal, but ultimately they may run the risk of reverse discrimination claims from those. In this instance, it would be males who are saying that they are negatively affected because the company is hiring based on gender. An example of a disparate impact form of discrimination is when there's like a neutral policy or practice that ultimately results in a disparate impact towards a minority group. So in this case, like for example, if it was a testing, it'd be an objective neutral test, but that testing resulted in a disparate amount of, for instance, Black candidates being eliminated from the selection process. And so although the company's efforts could be positive and aimed at increasing minority representation, they could ultimately be subject to a disparate impact claim. So as I said, there's a wide spectrum of risk, but the closer the connection between the decision-making on the basis of race and gender, the greater the risk. Thus, as the diverse slate requirements are imposed further along in the hiring process, for example, if they're imposed at the interview stage versus the applicant pool stage, there's greater risk the further it goes along, because the idea is that the more a decision maker has the ability to become aware of a candidate, applicant, or interview candidate's protected characteristics that they be basing hiring decisions based on that knowledge. So the further they are removed from knowing what a candidate or an applicant's protected characteristic is, the risk is less in that way. And so that's kind of generally the background that we'll start with, and then Annette will kind of go into more detail about the practical and legal considerations that employers will want to think about. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, so as we build this framework out a little bit more, the types of questions that we get are pretty consistent on diverse slates. Diverse slates have been around for quite some time. Many employers are using diverse slates in some way within their organization. It's a very common theme, a common strategy that has been used, but how it is implemented can look very different company by company. There isn't real legal guidance on these issues. We haven't seen any cases that specifically address diverse slates. We always, when we're talking about DE&I strategies on the risk spectrum that Sade mentioned, we're always thinking about diverse slates as being about, pretty close to that hiring decision. So it is one area that we're always pretty mindful of. In terms of the advice and the issues that we're talking through. The process of considering race or gender in any selection process, right, is likely to potentially cause questions. So as we think about this, the first question is, what's the coverage? So if we go to the next slide, we'll start identifying those issues. As I mentioned, just saying a company will say we use diverse slates across the organization doesn't really tell the whole story, right? How are you applying that diverse slate? And for purposes, for right now, I'll get to another slide shortly, but we're going to talk about this as a presumption. The presumption is that you want to build your candidate pools and make sure that they're moving through the process. You've got really great qualified candidates, so that's the goal at the very front end. But as you're moving them through, there has been some analysis typically that is done that demonstrates that you really have an issue with employees or candidates, potential candidates coming through the hiring process, but for whatever reason, they're not making it through. And the idea is that if they could only get in front of the interviewees, right, to talk through, or excuse me, the interviewers to talk through the issues, then these qualified candidates would stand a much greater chance of actually getting hired. So what's happening? And so this diverse slate presumption is designed to address that. The way we've seen it work best is when it's being applied to a discrete group of jobs, because one of the balances from a practical consideration is actually, on the one hand, you're trying to get your jobs filled. Your recruiters, your managers, your business in general needs to move forward with the, functions of the business, and this will slow down your process depending on how you implement it. So some companies take a very targeted approach and do it at certain levels that they've determined there is a need to improve the candidate pool and ensure that it makes that the individuals make it all the way through the process. They're high-profile positions. It could be in a particular division or a particular business unit that is really causing you to drive, the DE&I strategy, or you think you're going to have the most kind of bang for your buck on it. So thinking about the coverage is an important component or consideration as you move forward. There are some employers who have, instead of applying it to all jobs within a particular group, they're sort of looking at the business unit and they're saying, okay, what's the percentage over time over the course of the quarter? What percentage of jobs are we going to say, look, we really need to have diverse slates, ensure that there are diverse slates in that process. So you can fashion the diverse slate as you need to, or as, kind of makes most sense for your organization. It's really important to think about not having a set numeric number that must be at all times. As I said, it may slow things down just a bit, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So the idea of presumption versus requirement. So we typically talk about this from, look, it is presumed that employers, if you're implementing this diverse slate, that's going to be the presumption, that the jobs and the way you've defined the rule for your organization will be presumed to have the candidate pool in terms of diverse candidates that you have thought about having. But sometimes that really slows down the process, and it can take too long to make sure that you're hiring someone. So how do you deal with that? If you make it a blanket requirement, it will sort of, stagnate the process. You may have some, issues with your business processes. So you just want to make sure that you have an exception. So that's why we typically call it a presumption. If you don't have, though, enough qualified candidates, at the same time, you're trying to balance this because there's already been an identified need for implementing a diverse slate presumption. So you want to make sure that you're pushing the needle, pushing managers, pushing recruiters to make sure that you are hitting that, but at the same time, allowing the organization to move as you need to. So that would be one way that employers have tried to grapple with this issue and have kind of come to terms with it. You would though think about who is going to be deciding. How do you decide when you've done enough? So one step that some employers have done is kind of a look back. For any time that you've said, okay, we couldn't meet that diverse slate requirement, there's a look back period. So you make the hiring decision and there's a look back to understand the why. Get underneath that to understand, is it a pools issue? Is it qualifications, skills that you need to have improved for the particular candidate pool? But you allow yourself the opportunity to look back on any time you have that exception in place. And then you've got to think about, if you've got the same manager, same group that's constantly coming up with this exception, that's really a larger reason to need more strategic consideration about what's actually going on for those jobs so that you can come up with a broader solution for it. Making sure, I keep coming back to where, I hope I want to make sure we emphasize, we want to make sure that if you're doing diverse slates, you've got good candidate pools and that you continue working on that. So it's a dual approach. Diverse slates and continuing to engage in outreach and efforts to get qualified candidates and have a really concerted effort on that front so that you have a greater chance of moving folks through the process. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the approval process, right? So who's involved in approving that diverse slate and how you do that. What we typically, talk to employers about is having this dual process, this parallel process, during which anybody who's involved in the actual hiring decision doesn't have access to race and gender information. It keeps the process more clean from a legal and a risk perspective. So on the one hand, you're moving candidates through the process, you're moving them through, and then you have a different line that is telling or is determining whether the diverse slate presumption has been met or not. That definitely can slow things down a bit, but once you get this working into your systems, we have seen a lot of success for employers who are able to include that dual process. We've seen some use a, kind of scorecard perspective where they're telling, they're saying, yes, thumbs up or thumbs down, you can move forward with your offer. And so you're not sort of on an individualized basis telling folks, hey, this is the, you need 3 more, or 2 more Black people, or one more female, or 1 more Hispanic employee. It's not that level of detail. It's just a yes or no. You have met the diverse slate presumption and can move forward with extending that offer or not. Let's go on to the next slide so we can just talk briefly about what that implementation process might look like. So I mentioned the, sort of building that candidate pool. So I've got that as, a little star there next to that particular bullet because you want to make sure you're doing that. But obviously your recruiters or hiring managers are reviewing resumes and you're building that interview slate. In orange, we've got these 2 steps there. When are you going to validate that slate from a diversity perspective, right, to check that? Is it going to be before you actually hold the interviews, or is it going to be after you hold the interviews? We've seen employers do it, a couple of different ways. From a, legal risk mitigation perspective, ideally doing it before you conduct the interviews may be more advantageous. That also is going to help with the candidate experience as well. If you've got a top candidate that you've met with and you really want to extend an offer, but you're making that person sort of wait because you haven't met the diverse slate requirement and you just continue interviewing people, by the time you actually get that done and move to the next level, you may lose a terrific candidate. So beginning that process earlier, before you conduct the interview, would be the ideal scenario and an ideal way to look at it, but sometimes the timing, doesn't allow for that. So being really mindful, so these are considerations that you would take while you're implementing a diverse slate requirement or presumption, so that you can move folks along without slowing down your process. The other point is sort of, I mentioned that sometimes, after that offer is extended, if you've either allowed for an exception, and these typically aren't, managers deciding, well, I just can't hit it, depending on how you set it up. It should be more of a dialogue typically on what the efforts have been before you, set a rule and then just have the overall exception. But so it requires some dialogue around, hey, do we think that we've actually done what we can do and we're at a point where we really need to move forward with this particular hiring decision? But making sure you have that look back is really, really critical. If you're having a diverse slate presumption, you want to make sure that you're taking a look back. So with that, we want to talk about some the diverse slate best practices. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and as we do so, we're going to remind her about the CLE credit as well.
Hi there, can you hear me? I just hung up on myself.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds like you can hear me. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I literally went to press mute and hung up. So that was highly effective. Okay, next slide. We want to just talk about some best practices. So again, I want to reiterate Annette's comment that there are a lot of differing ways in which employers, focus a process around talent acquisition. There are obviously very common steps of a talent acquisition process across many employers, but there are different reasons for why they may be driving this kind of program, different ways in which they implement their process, different tools and techniques and platforms that they're using. So different programs can, some of these best practices are more applicable to certain programs than others. So first, for all programs, we want to reiterate that there should be consistent hiring standards for all candidates in the interview slate, that there not be anything different for underrepresented classifications of employees as compared to others, and that you are double checking for that consistency. Certainly from the legal viewpoint, it's helpful to actually, after these programs are implemented, go back from a legal perspective and audit them to take a look to really try to see whether there is consistency for those hiring standards. There is a recommendation, and again, some companies, do it this way, and may not, but we do think that there is importance in at least considering where there are identified shortfalls based on analysis of your hiring data. So in some instances, we have had circumstances where an employer has simply rolled out a diverse slate initiative without rooting it in the company's overall diversity and inclusion strategy. It's something coming out just in recruiting, or for example, they have not actually rooted it in actual shortfalls or areas of challenge that an employer might have. So we do recommend, at least again, because we're talking from the lawyer standpoint, that you conduct a privileged analysis to figure out what problem you might be trying to solve by going, and implementing a diverse slate program, and then, tailoring it accordingly. Certainly, you don't want to exclude anyone from the applicant pool based on EEO status. And this goes for every sort of step of the process. You don't want to be excluding people from the process, but instead thinking about how you can expand your funnel and expand the pool rather than limit it. Really, we see two of the most important concepts about this type of a program to be: one, widening your applicant pool as wide as you possibly can, going out and finding candidates who meet your criteria. There's a lot less legal risk in terms of searching, in every nook and cranny for the best talent that you can find, including, diverse or underrepresented talent. And then funneling them into, sort of the top of the funnel. We recommend you don't replace candidates to achieve diversity. So you don't want to be swapping people out, because again, that can lead directly to a claim or an effect of, choosing people based on their EEO status. You also want to make sure, and this relates to a point I made before, that candidates on the interview slate meet all of your qualifications. You don't want to alter your criteria. You want to make sure, again, that there's this consistency in hiring standards and the way in which you're applying your overall recruiting process. This does not change it. It's an overlay of the way in which you do your process. On the next slide, we'll continue on some best practices. So we recommend, and some of this is, again, from a lawyer perspective, not maintaining separate lists of minority or female candidates. This serves to underscore the idea that you're treating people differently, or that they're on a special list, or that list may be selected differently than other candidates. There's a lot of ways that practically that type of list can be used in the wrong way. And, practically there's a variety of things we've seen in how this plays out that can create also evidentiary issues, if something like this gets challenged. We consider that you holistically consider the qualifications of all candidates. That goes into the next bullet of, we recommend not ranking candidates for inclusion in a hiring slate, especially not on their EEO status. Again, looking holistically at various qualifications. Certainly, ranking isn't, unlawful per se. Again, it's more in a best practice category of, we've seen a lot of ways in which a ranking process can go wrong. So if you prefer that, or you want some type of way of differentiating between, candidates, then certainly, you want to be reviewing that to make sure there isn't an, inherent sort of bias built in there, or there isn't an over reliance on one factor as compared to another, and certainly not the, diversity or representation status of any particular candidate. You obviously want to make sure that any hiring or promotion decisions are done in a neutral way without regard to race or gender or any protected category, depending on what state that you're sitting in. And so the framework that Annette laid out is meant to try to divorce as much as possible the actual decision-making process with the process of ensuring there is a diverse slate that's proceeding, through the process overall. And then finally, we recommend, to the extent that you can, again, that you divorce the decision makers that select candidates, for either slates and or for the final hiring decision from those that are tracking the diverse status of those candidates for purposes of your diverse slate, presumption or rule. To the extent you can have somebody tracking diversity status of people on the back end, and then decision makers are making their decisions entirely based on qualifications and non-discriminatory reasons for making those decisions, that's ideal. In picking apart that particular recommendation with a lot of different employers, however, it does get difficult. I mean, there's ways in which processes are built. There's only, a set number of people who participate in the recruiting process. There are different challenges. So, we recommend, kind of picking things apart, potentially we use a lot with our clients the concept of a process map. And so we've process mapped the recruiting process with clients, where we've been able to see an overlay in a process where people may be able to assist in looking at diversity status, but then, minimize the risk again of having decision makers actually be tracking that as well. So just think about how you might pick apart that process to try to implement, these ways of pushing forward a diverse slate program. So it looks like we've run out of time. I'm sorry we couldn't spend more. We're here for questions. Feel free to email at any time. This is an important topic. We're really delighted to be working with so many clients around these important issues of pushing forward this business imperative for most businesses now. So thanks for attending. We
Laura,
look forward to seeing you at the next session.
And we want to make sure we share the CLE code as well. So the CLE code for this session is Seyfarth, so SS8670.
Shoot, I forgot it. Sorry, the password for CLE, if you're still around, is Seyfarth Shaw, SS, so it's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw, 8670, SS 8670. Sorry about that.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.